Is this behind your paywall, or is this just
No,
gonna be free?
this is out front. So matter of fact, we're live now. So let me
Cool.
get that link so people can find us here. There we are. Okay. So did you play a bunch this week or week one, I should say?
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
played quite a bit on DraftKings, and I played both the 1 day slates on FanDuel.
How did you like, I didn't do much with the FanDuel. Like it was it was just a little too short for me. Like I actually kind of really enjoyed the opportunity to spread my money out over a full weekend. Like I've got a $10 golf lineup going right now, and it's actually like running pretty good right this second. I'm like, this is actually not bad. I could kind of get into this golf thing, 4 days worth on my $10. Like that's not too bad for a little sweat.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't play a lot of golf. Golf's good though. But yeah, I agree. I like the full weekend stuff where you can do late swap. You can, late swap was kind of tough with XFL though, because the games
Yeah,
were fast and they schedule them 3 hours apart, and there
they
wasn't like a lot of breaks. And I was trying to watch the games too, and it was it
yeah,
was
they
tough to
bump
like.
right up on each other like that.
Right.
And then, yeah, so it's like, fourth quarter, you're doing your late swaps. You can't just
Yeah.
like wait till the last second. So,
I think both the late games locked before the early games ended, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah, yeah,
on both days.
I think that's right. And that's like, you think back to NFL season, like the 4 o'clock, or for me, 4 o'clock on the East Coast games get done, and you get like that hour-long break or so between that and the Sunday night football games to fire off your showdown lineups.
Right.
And
You
so
get
it's like,
time. Yeah.
that's what I need, that breather. I need that
Yeah.
buffer zone. Like that's all super helpful and stuff. So anyway, well, we've got this link tweeted out, Ben. So folks are going to start trickling in here any minute, and just want to welcome you to the show. Obviously, guys, this is sort of first run for us doing some live content here at Number Ball. Obviously, XFL Week 2 is what brings us here. And we're joined by CBS Sports' Ben Gretsch. Ben is a dude who I am very familiar with. Matter of fact, when I first started getting into like listening to fantasy football podcasts, it was Ben Gretsch on RotoViz Radio doing alternate projections, man. So kind of an OG here in these fantasy streets. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing good, man. Yeah, that's yeah, I've been around a little while now. It's funny because when I started at RotoViz, there were, some guys before me that were kind of the OGs, and the John
Yeah.
Moores and Matt Friedman, who's still over at Action Network. But kind of funny to be referred to as the OG nowadays.
Yeah, man, you're an old timer. I remember they were all about alternate projections and range of outcomes, and that's just, it's honestly kind of gone a long way in like what I find valuable in fantasy content in general. Like I got super into projections and building out my own projections template. Matter of fact, that's honestly what led me to end up here at Number Ball. Jeff, who's in charge of the company here, found my template that I created, and I just give out to everyone, and he thought that was pretty cool, and he was using it for his season long stuff, and anyway invited me on, and here we are. And so how's things at CBS, man? This is a pretty cool little gig for you there.
Great, man. Yeah, just staying busy this off season with XFL. It's fun to have more live football, and the quality is not quite there as it isn't in NFL season, but I've been enjoying it. It's kind of silly to get this into XFL football, but it's still football to me. It's still entertaining, so I'm here for it.
Yeah, it's super silly. Like it's not a use of time that any of our parents would endorse or anything like that. But it's fun, man. It's football for another 10 or 12 weeks, and so hopefully the plug doesn't get pulled. I was going to pick your brain on this. Like I kind of DM'd you about this earlier. The DraftKings and FanDuel contests seem to be lagging a little bit further behind. I'm a little bit concerned on like what that means. And I could just be completely way off, and these contests could fill up tomorrow morning, or, closer to noon, or 2 p.m., right at lock. But it looks like these things are trending towards overlay, which is obviously not good for DFS, and probably has some sort of implications towards, just the game itself. So do you think like we're just on the verge of, a little bit of a downfall? I mean, obviously week one, it doesn't get much better than that, right? As far as excitement.
Yeah, it's definitely gonna fall off after week one, right? Like we saw that with the AAF. I was tracking that a little bit, their TV ratings and everything, and there was a big fall off, and then it kind of stabilized for a while, and then it just kind of went away. And I I think it's concerning, like if they don't fill, but I don't know. I mean,
Well, I just look at it like if the DFS guys aren't into it enough, like that's like the best chance that the XFL has of like getting legs, is like real big engagement from people who don't live in these cities. I mean, there's only 8 cities represented in this thing, and so you're trying to draw a national audience. That means getting your fantasy guys, getting your DFS guys, and getting your just hardcore football fans, and they all need to be in for those numbers to be up where they want them and everything. So yeah, I hope the numbers stay strong. But obviously, week one, everybody's kind of excited. It's kind of the Wild West, and I think a lot of people lost money week one too, and probably not quite coming back to the well here in week two. So anyway, it'll be interesting. Where are you at with your general XFL familiarity? Like, if I just give you a name, are you at the point where you're like, boom, I know what team they're on, know what position they are? Or is it still like for me, there's like at least like 3 mental steps I have to go through before I'm like, okay, I know which team and which position that player is still on?
I mean, that's a good question. I would guess for the majority of the fantasy relevant guys that I have a pretty good feel for what team they're on. But yeah, there's definitely guys you could probably throw out there that I'd be like, I got to think about that one.
Yeah, I mean, like I've got my coaches down pat, I've got my offensive coordinators down pat, and I've got my starting quarterbacks. They're definitely good, but yeah, it definitely helps to be looking at a roster or a depth chart or something like that when we get going on that. So overall, Ben, why don't we talk a little bit about week one and just sort of lessons learned? Obviously, we'll be getting 2 new starting quarterbacks, so that's going to change things up quite a bit. But just sort of big picture takeaways. What did you see from the caliber of football and the style of football in the XFL? And do you imagine like the gameplay from DFS angle then sets up to be different than what we're traditionally used to on, say, like a Thanksgiving slate in NFL or something like that, where we're used to shorter game slates, but we're playing them possibly a little bit different?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a huge difference, I think, particularly with the running back position. I mean, we didn't see very much running back production. There's only 2 teams that had over 20 running back carries. One of them lost. It was Tampa Bay. They went to Quentin Flowers late in the game and were running a lot of read option. St. Louis was the other one. They're probably going to be the run heaviest team in the league. But besides that, there was a lot of teams that were very pass heavy. And I think you can chalk that up to the timing rules. Up until the 2-minute warning, basically running clock on every play, even in completions, plays out of bounds. And then after the 2-minute warning, you get a stop clock on every play. So, in the fourth quarter, you're not going to get teams running. There's not like a huge incentive to run outside the 2-minute warning, because even if they pass, the clock's going to continue to run. And then inside the 2-minute warning, there is some incentive. The clock starts to run again after the ball is spotted if the player was tackled in bounds. But you can only run off like 20 seconds max if you run the play clock all the way down, as opposed to like 40 seconds. So what we saw was leading teams were still willing to throw. And we have a lot of spread offenses in this league, spread offensive minds, Hal Mummy in Dallas. You got June Jones in Houston. There's several guys that run these air raid systems, very vertical systems. And I mean, there was like Dallas was almost 80% pass rate. I mean, that's fun. That's great. I like that for fantasy. But with the way that the lineups are structured in DFS, you have 2 flex positions. I think the biggest takeaway was, if you're playing cash lineups, when I was playing in the AAF, I was loading up those flex spots with running backs. But in XFL, I'm going to be leaning a lot heavier on the projectable targets in those spots. And especially in tournaments, I think, the wide receivers are going to have higher ceilings. It's going to be a lot harder, I think, for a running back to hit a 20-point game than a wide receiver. So I think you'll be seeing a lot more 4 wide receiver lineups with 1 running back and a QB.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the way you have to play it. At least if you're trying to play it straight whatsoever. If you're trying to get contrarian, I could see you trying to insert a couple running backs in your lineup. But I think you mentioned this in your article today, and I mentioned it in mine too, sort of independently of one another. I noticed was let's try not to over analyze this first week and just assume like we're going to get a carbon copy of that moving forward. Like there's some signal, to use some Ben Gretsch terminology. There's some signal there, but we need to be careful that we don't assume that that's going to be the case. Like, I mean, it's not outside the realm of possibilities that next week, like instead of 80% passing touchdowns and 20% rushing, those numbers are flipped. I mean, that could happen. I don't think that's particularly likely. I think we've seen some sense of a blend of what the XFL will be offering, but that's on the table, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's exactly right. When you think about, tournament mindsets, GPP mindsets, that's the kind of stuff that you try to leverage. This could happen. Let's find a way where maybe we don't think it's likely, but the payoff is outsized if we're correct.
Well, yeah, and then one of the things you mentioned was not only are the teams running fewer plays or rushing on fewer plays, but we're also splitting that work up again among more backs. And so obviously we're used to splitting up targets among several receivers. You only need a 20 to 25% target share and you're in business. You've got plenty of viable targets. But if you're only getting 30 or 40% of running back rush attempts, like that may not be good enough to carry you, especially if you're not a dual threat player. So it seems like there's just very few bell cows that we can even rely on. Yeah,
there were some rotations. The other big thing that we saw in week 1 was just a number of mobile quarterbacks. I mean, I mentioned Tampa used Quentin Flowers a little bit. Or did I already mention that on this? Sorry, I just did a radio hit a little bit ago. I think I mentioned on the radio hit. I'm getting confused. Tampa used Quentin Flowers in the read option a little bit. Phillip Walker, the top quarterback last week, very mobile. Jordan Ta'amu had like a 37-yard QB draw and ran for like 70-something yards. Cardell Jones showed off some mobility. He rushed like 9 times. We're getting Josh Johnson back this week. Mm-hmm. Brandon Silvers is banged up for Seattle. He's going to play, but I think we might see a little bit of BJ Daniels this week. I mean, we might have mobile quarterbacks in 6 of the offenses this week, and probably at least 5 where they will play a major role. And that impacts the rushing ability as well. But yeah, I mean, there were very few elite workhorse backs, and this week I'm pretty much targeting the ones that were and hoping that that stays pretty firm. There's a couple backs that I like that are a little on the contrarian side, but for the most part, I'm going to be mixing up things on the wide receiver side.
Yeah, and then I think I tweeted this out earlier this week. $34,000 was the amount it cost to put together last week's optimal lineup. So $16K left on the table there at DraftKings. The pricing tightens up a lot more, just going from 1 week to the next, week 1 to week 2, it's going to tighten up a lot, but I still don't feel constrained hardly at all by the pricing. There still seems to be quite a bit of value on the board. Would you agree with that?
Yep. Yeah, there's definitely, and we'll get into the plays obviously, but there's definitely a lot of very viable plays that you can round out rosters with. You can't play all the top plays, but you can get as many of them in as you want and still get to some variability at the lower end of the pricing too, because there's not just like one chalk low price play, but there are a few that stand out for sure.
Yeah, why don't we look at some of these games and hop right into it then? First game, we've got New York Guardians at the DC Defenders. That's my Defenders, Ben. I don't know if you've declared a side yet, but lifelong Defenders fan here.
Nice. Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I'll just be a bandwagoner on Houston probably because they look sweet.
Oh, gosh, man.
I'm not a bandwagoner anywhere else, but Houston looks sweet. You can't knock an air raid offense
I
like that with a
know,
sweet
I
mobile quarterback.
know.
That team is
You
good.
and every other person on fantasy Twitter are freaking Houston fans. So my defenders will crush you all. I actually kind of feel like the defenders got a little bit fortunate, had a couple defensive scores last week. Didn't really get to see a ton out of Cardale Jones. Like, not the best as far as completion percentage, but definitely moved the ball down the field and was successful in leading the offense. And when your defense scores 2 touchdowns for you, like it's a lot easier, to control the rest of the offense. But he'll be going up against another quarterback who's in a very similar position. Matt McGloin and the guys there in New York, they had a couple defensive scores of their own. So neither quarterback really had to put the pedal to the metal last week. How would you compare McGloin and Cardale Jones? Have we seen, what did you see out of Cardale Jones, and to what extent are you interested in exposure to him this week?
Yeah, I think he's probably going to be maybe my third most owned quarterback. I will make some lineups with him. He's not going to be the top of my list, but he was efficient. 9 yards per attempt last week, threw the ball well down the field. I thought he was good. I didn't really know what to expect from him. We haven't seen a ton of him at the NFL level. Obviously, won a national championship in college, but not somebody that we had seen at I don't know what level the XFL is at, but at this level, I mean, maybe national championship football is at that level too. I don't know, but yeah. Cardale Jones was pretty good last week. Efficient. I think he had 26 pass attempts and 9 rush attempts. So my concern is this is going to be an offense where he takes off and scrambles a little bit, lower volume. It can be an efficient passing offense, but lower volume. And then you have DeAndre Tompkins back. He missed last week, and that kind of mixes up things in the passing game with the receiving options. Rashad Ross, their main guy, their high-priced guy, was an AAF stud. Scored last week on a 31-yard touchdown, had a 21-yard reception as well, but those were his only 2 targets. He only ran routes on 68% of dropbacks. Think that will rise for him. He was a January trade acquisition, so they had him listed on the second team initially, but they had him behind Tompkins, and so I'm kind of a little confused there, like how to play that. And then you have Eli Rogers, who had 6 catches on 6 targets for 72 yards. You have Malachi Dupree, who was really involved in running a lot of routes. So now you kind of have 4 functional receivers plus Kari Lee, who only saw the 1 target but had a long touchdown on that play. I'm having a hard time figuring out how I want to stack Cardale.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. And if you're doing MME, it kind of gives you an opportunity to maybe go with a pair of those guys in every Cardale lineup that you go with, and then maybe bring it back with one player from the New York side. That's going to be sort of my locked and loaded, prescribed way of generally approaching this slate, especially if you're doing any sort of MME building. I love, going 3 from the one offense, 1 from the other, and that's going to leave you 2 more flex spots to fill out that you can use sort of one-offs, or do like a mini stack, somewhere else if you're going to do it that way. Obviously what you're really hoping for is that you pick the core of your lineup around a game that is a substantially different environment than the other 3 games on the slate. It doesn't always happen that way, but it somewhat frequently does. If you were stacking up around PJ Walker last week, you probably hit the cash line, depending on which pair of guys you went with, and then who you brought it back with. So you just kind of want to eliminate the number of decisions that you have to get right for your lineup to do well. So I think doing that gives you a lot of options. So if you're going to MME, like it's interesting. The way I sort of see it, I think Eli Rogers to me looks like the clear-cut one at this point. Just the amount of time he's on the field, the number of routes he's running. And then I just sort of see it as like a 3-person committee for number 2 duties between Dupree, Ross, and Tompkins. That's sort of the way I'm playing it. So I probably want roughly as much volume to each of those guys, maybe plus or minus depending on price and what it takes to get those guys in there. But yeah, Lee would probably need to do a little bit more. I'm just generally not as interested in the tight ends, in this format. If there were some that were truly getting a lot of volume, that might be a different story. And I think we'll probably talk about a couple that might fit that realm. Nick Truesdale in Tampa being one, and Donald Parham, a guy I don't mind out of Dallas. But overall, do you sort of agree with that on the tight end front?
Yes, I'm not. I don't think I played any tight ends last week. I'm not playing a lot of tight ends. I probably won't play Lee anywhere. I'm just mentioning him in terms of stealing target
Right.
share, but he was banged up this week as well. I think he was limited all the way through Friday, so he's
Yeah.
not somebody I think that should be considered in lineups. But he's a functional receiver. Just another one on their offense. I
Yeah.
I kind of agree with your breakdown of the receivers too. I do lean more towards Ross just because he's been so productive everywhere he's played. I mean, he was a star in the AAF. He led the league in receiving touchdowns. He was second in yards. Kind of an every week option in DFS in the AAF if anybody was playing that. Um, for 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 DC here, I think that he will emerge eventually as their number one. I mean, that's kind of my expectation. I think he has that talent level, and he was productive last week. I don't see why they would scale him back. He was very productive. He only got 2 targets, and he both were 20+ yard catches, one for a
Mhm.
touchdown. So I like him a lot. I also like Jarrell Presley of their backs. I thought he looked um, not amazing, but better than Donnell Pumphrey in terms of running the ball. They ran about the same amount of routes, 14 to 13, leaning towards
Mhm.
Pumphrey. But I think Presley has, Pumphrey was the only other back that really played for DC, and he's an undersized back. I think Presley has one of the more locked in lead back roles. Not like the most, but a pretty stable one, and I think he's an option.
Yeah, it's kind of weird trying to figure out exactly what to do with that backfield. And they're going to be touchdown favorites here at
Right.
home. DC is, and so that kind of brings it to a whole nother question: like, to what extent do you even trust these totals and spreads? Because I think Vegas is sort of guessing at this, not unlike we are, but I kind of see Presley and Pumphrey and maybe a little bit closer, but at least closer relative to price. They have different price tags going this week, so you have to take that into consideration. It's 7K for Presley and 3,900 for Pumphrey. So if you are in a salary saving situation, you could kind of consider that drop down. But as we mentioned earlier, that there's probably not a big reason for that. But overall, the fact that it's a touchdown game I guess I shouldn't call it a touchdown game in the XFL. Everything's a touchdown game. But how do you see that spread? Do you see any signal behind that spread?
I mean, I think New York's offense was for winning by 20 points. They were a little bit underwhelming. I didn't think I mean, I think the jury's still out of Matt McGloin is the way that I've been kind of phrasing it. I don't think he played amazing. I thought he was all right, but I also didn't really have a very high opinion of him coming in, and I wasn't swayed by that one game. I thought he missed some throws that he should have made. So they're going on the road now. They played at home. One thing that was pretty prevalent in week one was a lot of the road offenses struggled. And you can get a little outside the box and be like, I wonder what kind of accommodations these teams have. I mean, they're probably not flying private planes and staying at the Ritz. So I don't.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thought as well, and it's not a long road trip for New York down to DC, but they're going to be going away from home, and they, like you said, the defense was so good and Tampa's offense struggled so much to get the ball into the end zone that New York kind of just ran the ball and coasted to a win with their defensive touchdowns. So if they get behind DC, I think they're going to have to do a lot different than what they did last week to win, and I'm just not convinced that they can. So I actually like DC on the spread, to win by more than 7, and think that that I'm kind of trusting that and trusting their high team total and going with Presley as one of my main core backs and playing some Cardell, like I said.
Well, it's an interesting point you raised about the hotel, which makes me wonder. When you're out on the road, what's your hotel of choice? Like, what are you looking for in a hotel? Ben, it's you and your wife, and you've had a long day. You went out of town to go get something done, and you got to crash for the night. What type of spots you looking for?
Dude, I'm like just looking for something close, like it's location for
Yeah,
me. Whatever. I mean,
you got to have the 3D printing pancake machine like the Holiday Inn Express has, where you push the button and it goes down the conveyor belt and comes out the other side. Have you seen that one?
I have not seen that one. That sounds pretty
It's
sweet though.
it's revolutionary hotel breakfast technology that they're doing there at the Holiday Inn Express. And I have to imagine that if any of these teams, were to stay at Holiday Inn Express, it probably helped them out there on the road. But anyway, speaking of road favorites, how about that for a transition? Tampa Bay goes to Seattle. I can't believe this line. Tampa Bay actually favored at Seattle. Seattle looks like they're going to have like the gnarliest home crowd of all time. And they didn't look horrible, I didn't think, against DC. And Tampa sort of did look horrible in a couple of different ways. So this whole line sort of threw me off a little bit, especially given the location. How do you see things playing out? Obviously, we've got no Aaron Murray in this game. What does that mean for Tampa?
Yeah, it sounds like people think that Taylor Cornelius is going to be better than Aaron Murray. I mean, I don't know. I've never seen Taylor Cornelius throw a football in my life, so I have no idea. I think, Quentin Flowers is good, and he'll probably play more in the first half than he did last week. They didn't really start using him until the second half. Tampa Bay did move the ball against New York. They got inside the 10 on 4 different drives and only came away with 3 points. Murray threw a pick in the end zone. They settled for that field goal that they never should have early in the second half, and then got stuffed twice late in the game. But they actually told more yards from scrimmage than any offense last week in their 23-3 loss. And, I don't love changing the quarterback when, things did seem to work at least reasonably well. I wasn't as disappointed in Murray. Murray missed a lot of throws. He threw a couple bad picks, but I thought he made some decent throws, particularly in the first half. But I agree with you. Tampa Bay also played on Sunday, and Seattle played on Saturday. They were both on the East Coast last week, but Tampa Bay's on a short week, going from a road game in New York now to a road game in Seattle. I don't like that. That's not an offense I want to look at, especially with the quarterback change. And if Flowers plays more, that's probably going to mean more running. I really liked Jalen Tolliver and Dan Williams, their 2 main outside receivers. Yes. I like Reese Horn as well, their slot guy. They just weren't using him a ton. They ran a lot of 2 tight end formations. They used a fullback on a lot of formations. Mark Trestman was kind of throwing back to like 1990s formations. And you kind of have to just look at the 2 outside receivers for their passing game, or Truesdale, as you mentioned, but I'm probably not going to be playing a lot of Truesdale. So Tolliver, who's still priced pretty low on DraftKings, didn't really produce last week. Aaron Murray missed him at least once running wide open in the back of the end zone. Then another time they talked about on the broadcast, he was wide open running it's kind of a broken play. Murray was rolling out, but he was running free for what could have been like a 35, 40-yard touchdown. And Murray just didn't see him. So Tolliver's production could have been there. The points could have been there. The routes are there. The snaps were there. I like him as a cheap option. And it's kind of him or Joe Horn, who we kind of skipped over New York in the last game, but Joe Horn is another really cheap option. Got 8 targets last week and played in the slot 100% of his snaps. And he's going up against DC, who just got crushed by Seattle's slot receiver, Austin Prohl, for 88 yards and 2 touchdowns. So I kind of like Horn a little bit more in cash games, but Tolliver's going to be a GPP option for sure. But I'm not really thrilled about Tampa Bay's passing game.
Yeah, Tolliver is like my lock it in play of the week, my stone cold lead pipe. Like I love it. I love the price. I mean, when you play Tolliver, you can almost do whatever you want at that point at a salary of 3,900. Like that's so cheap for a guy who's just running like all the routes. He's actively involved in getting targets in this offense. I think you can make qualms about what a target's worth in this offense, but as far as guys who just like stood out when I was doing the projections and looking at values, like Tolliver is the clear cut to me number one option as far as generating value in your lineup. So obviously I don't recommend pushing the lock button on him in 150 lineups if that's what you're doing, but we definitely to me he stands out among literally everybody else as far as guys I was interested in. But yeah,
what's your take on Joe Horn?
Yeah, I like Joe Horn too. He graded out well. I have sort of a man crush on Mikhail McKay, but his price at 10-2 is just maybe a little bit uh, presumptuous about what his production value is. I think he's a guy who's still going to project pretty well, but 10-2 is a lot to pay for a receiver who's not exactly yeah, in a super potent situation. So I think
Right.
overall I kind of agree with you. Like it's not a passing game that I'm looking to get several pieces of. I don't want any McGloin honestly in my tournament exposure. The way I kind of see mixing up my exposure is to probably pick three guys, maybe a fourth, and sprinkle them in proportion with how confident I am. And McGloin probably will not be that one of those guys for me. But one guy who I do kind of like is Darius Victor in that backfield. Another guy who could save you a little bit of money. He's priced down 4,100 this week on DraftKings. And I don't know how you see that split going between Victor and Cook, but I sort of liked how often I saw Victor on the field and just, how many routes he was running comparatively to Cook. And I thought he could be a guy who, if you're picking one of these sort of 50-50 backfield type of situations, may make sense from a price perspective and just sort of a general way the Guardians want to play football. They seem to be, much more of a run focused offense than pass focused.
Yeah, definitely Kevin Gilbride offense. Victor to me, and I made the comparison before the season of Tim Cook looking like the Brandon Jacobs. He's a bigger back, and then either Victor or Justin Stockton maybe in that Ahmad Bradshaw role that Gilbride used to use that dual back system in his old Giants offenses. And when I watched Victor, I saw a lot of Ahmad Bradshaw. I couldn't get away from the
Mm-hmm.
comparison. He's good, and I thought Ahmad Bradshaw was a good player for the record. I don't think that's a knock at all. And Victor was very good. I thought they used him more as the game went on as well. It seemed so.
Mm-hmm.
I like him. The only concern I have is that Tim Cook got both of their first two conversion tries. They went for one on all three touchdowns. He punched them both in, and then Victor got one later in the game. It got stuffed. Cook being kind of the bigger back, getting the first options and being more effective. I'm concerned that Cook will get the first goal line looks in this game.
Mm-hmm.
So Victor is on my list, but he's not like near the top as a road dog, and not really being sure about whether or not he'll get the red zone touches.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and then hopping back to that Seattle game, the Seattle Tampa Bay game in Seattle, if we're trying to diagnose that backfield, it perhaps is one of the more difficult ones to do. It looks like a true three-headed monster there. Do you make any sense out of Kenneth Farrow, Trey Williams, and Jaquan Gardner?
yeah, I mean no, but if we want to look at just their week one usage, I think we could define roles from week one, but who knows if those will carry over. But that would be that Gardner basically was the early down running back. He played the fewest snaps. He rushed the most times. He only ran 6 routes. The other two backs both ran 16 routes. So he was not as active in the passing game. And in a three-headed backfield, I'm not taking the guy who isn't going to be catching passes, right? And so Gardner's kind of out for me. Farrell got more work in both phases. He ran the second most times. I don't have his numbers in front of me, but was fairly effective, I think. Also caught 4 passes, and then Trey Williams caught 4 passes himself. But so Farrell and Williams essentially just split that receiving work, 16 routes each. Um, and Williams was more of just a passing down back. So if I'm playing any of them, it's probably Farrow. He probably has the greatest likelihood of catching a few passes and scoring a touchdown. Williams last week did score, but it was on a pass play. I don't think we can expect that every single week. I don't love them, but Farrow would be the one I lean towards if you're hoping, that some of these concerns about this line and that Tampa Bay is playing on the road, far travel on a short week, do lean in Seattle's favor, and Seattle's able to win this game. I think Farrow would be the back.
Yeah, and then figuring out this passing game is kind of interesting. They just signed S.J. Green, who apparently is some sort of Canadian Football League legend, a bit of a old timer from there, I suppose. But I don't know whether he'll be super involved this week. I would imagine very limited, if so. But I want to get your take on Keenan Reynolds versus Austin Proehl, because, a lot of the peripheral numbers would probably suggest that, this is really Reynolds' receiving group to lead. And, Proehl scored a couple touchdowns, and people are going to remember that. And, deservedly so. He had a great game. But Reynolds has sort of, got a lot of those numbers that we're looking for to, project out further.
Yep. I agree with that. I mean, Reynolds got targets on all 3 of their conversion tries. He caught 1. I think he only caught 2 of 7 targets during the actual play of the game, non-conversions, and it had single-digit yardage, like 5 yards, 6 yards. But Silvers wasn't very good throwing to anyone but the backs. He completed 8 of 9 passes to the running backs. He only completed 13 of 31 to wide receivers and tight ends. Just wasn't very good getting the ball down the field. I don't think that means he can't do that. I think there's a chance that he plays a little bit better. He's kind of I'm going to have a couple Silvers lineups in case, because I do think, like, I like Seattle in this game. I do think that there's a chance that Tampa comes out flat after a kind of embarrassing loss, and then, new quarterback, all those things, and Seattle's able to control the game at home a little bit. And if they do, Seattle was willing to throw enough against DC that I am, thinking that Silvers could have a decent game, probably more for the 2-game Saturday slate on FanDuel. The better quarterbacks are on the Sunday slate. So I'm considering a little bit of Silvers. As far as Proehl versus Reynolds, though, I agree with you. I'm leaning Reynolds pretty big. Proehl's going to be one that I'm going to be underweight on. I think he'll be fairly popular. He had 88 yards and 2 touchdowns last week, but had a 60-something yard catch and run touchdown. A lot of yards after the catch. That stuff doesn't translate well or sustain well week over week. More of just a slot guy, right? His other 5 catches went for 20 yards or 30 yards or something like that. He did get 10 targets, and he is going to be a part of that passing game, but I kind of feel like he just kind of hit the efficiency luck last week, whereas Reynolds saw so many targets in the red zone, particularly on conversions. It just seemed to indicate that he's going to have a role in that area that I think he has the potential to see a big boost in his efficiency next week, maybe get in the end zone, whereas I think Proehl's will have to come down. And if you consider, what the field's going to be on, probably more people will be on Proehl. So, yeah, I lean Reynolds as the better play, but it's tough to love either of them. This game has a really low over-under. I do think that's pretty fair. Tampa's offense looked pretty old school, and Seattle's, like I said, Silvers didn't do great throwing the ball down the field. So I'm not going to play a ton of guys from this game, but I will throw in a couple Silvers lineups.
Do you like any of these tight ends? They've got like 100 of them there in Seattle, but obviously Evan Rodriguez probably the lead dog there based on what we saw last week. Does he interest you at all, or just we're fading tight ends from this game?
Yeah, I think it was Colin Jeter who played the most snaps and ran the most routes. But yeah, Evan Rodriguez was involved. They had another dude involved. No, I mean, their top 3 tight ends all play between 35 and 45% of the snaps. I don't want to play any of them. Not with a inaccurate quarterback as well, like we were just talking about. No, that's too thin.
Yep, agreed with that. So that brings us to our next game, Ben, which is Renegades and Wildcats. Obviously, really interesting game from both of these teams last week. They'll both enter the game 0-1, and obviously turmoil there in LA. They're like trading star players and firing defensive coordinators, and I mean, it's just like. I love it, man. This is very, very WWE here of the XFL to just bring in all this drama.
It's like what you do in your fantasy league, your home fantasy league. Like your team performs after week 1, you just start trading guys and cutting.
You got to send a message to the team, the team, man. Absolutely. So but they will get a new quarterback, which I'm hopeful of Josh Johnson. He's actually maybe my favorite. I may even like him better than PJ Walker this week, but I would play Josh Johnson if he were playing against the Detroit Lions. But you're telling me he gets to play against the Dallas Renegades. Yeah, I love Josh Johnson. He's been a viable guy for us in NFL fantasy. Anytime he gets spot start duties, he's just that type of player. You could probably project him for like north of 20% of team rush attempts, and that makes him. It gives him a really good floor and gives him a really good chance to sort of surpass his quarterback peers the way that PJ Walker did last week. Obviously, if you had, PJ Walker and you also paired it with either Defenders D or Guardians D last week, it almost didn't matter what else you did. Like if you got those two things right, you were probably doing pretty well. So, I think trying to focus around the right quarterbacks and the right offensive situations can go a long way. And I have a lot of faith in Josh Johnson that he could be that guy for LA. Do you agree with that?
I like him. I'm not quite as high on him as you. I mean, I think he's a good real life quarterback. I think, he's mobile. The concern I have is how healthy is he? I'm pretty sure it's a leg injury that he's coming back from, right? So will that affect his mobility? He was really good for Washington a couple years ago, like you said, in the NFL. But actually, I just looked it up. Never threw for 200 yards in any of those games. He was doing so much with his legs. He didn't really show off a ton of passing upside. I think he had 4 games, no 200-yard games, no multiple passing touchdown games. So not probably the most passing upside. Now that is a big deal for Nelson Spruce, who was our highest targeted player in week 1, highest receptions, really big game, 15 targets, 11 catches, 100 and something yards. I like Spruce a lot, but I'm a little concerned about the quarterback change and how that's going to impact him. But if you're going to stack Johnson with somebody, it's almost certainly has to be Spruce, in my opinion. I don't know how you feel about that, but the secondary receivers there were kind of splitting routes and all of that, and then also were just kind of pushed to the side by Spruce's dominant target share, which I think was like 35%.
Yeah, well, a couple injuries to monitor in that situation. Obviously, Dewan Harris is out this week in the backfield, and Saeed Blacknall is listed as doubtful currently. So that just came out. Blacknall was sort of running as the number 2 behind Spruce. So, there were 2 other guys that I sort of had my eye on. That was Jordan Smallwood and Adonis Jennings. They'll both sort of be launched up a little bit further in the pecking order. So maybe that makes them just a touch more interesting. Like, I'm with you that like Spruce had the most dominant performance of any receiver. But maybe those targets get split up just a tad differently this coming week. But overall, I think, if we're going to make NFL comps, Spruce is as close to like a Michael Thomas-y type of wide receiver as we're going to find in the XFL. I think like just a guy who's almost a lock to get his volume. Has very sure hands, is probably going to be among the league leaders in catch rate. So like the targets equal receptions for him more than any other player. So if you can project him to get 8 to 10 to 12 targets, as sort of a range, then he's going to play well, and you can pretty much fire him up. And you just have to determine whether like at the 10-4 that he cost in DraftKings, can you afford to get him in that lineup? And, for the most part, that's not a very difficult thing to do. But obviously, thinking what we know about tournament play, what if Spruce still has a fine game and he catches 6 balls for 60 yards and gives you 12 points, but Jordan Smallwood is the guy who caught 3 for 70 with a long touchdown, so we kind of got to go through that. But I do think Smallwood and Jennings are slightly elevated in this situation. I'm not interested in the tight ends, per usual there, but I do want to ask you about Elijah Hood, who's probably one of the closest things we will see in this league to bell cow running back. Obviously, we talked about how many routes he ran and was not targeted. So I think that's a really tricky piece that a lot of people would probably not pick up on, and a really good opportunity to spot potential targets. I mean, it just so happened that they didn't look his way, and that happens, especially for running backs, depending on where the quarterback's looking. So Elijah Hood, he'll cost you what, 6,500 this week. So I think that's perfectly fair, and I'd be really interested in playing him at that price.
Yeah, he's definitely on my list. Good, really strong snap share, like you said. Only came out of the game. They do the sideline interviews. The first time he came out of the game was after that hurdle. That was like, I don't know, all over. If you saw in the XFL media this week, it was like all over Twitter, and it was like the screenshot for a lot of like articles. He came off the field after that play, and they were interviewing him about the hurdle on the sideline, and he was very clearly winded, and it seemed very obvious that he only rotated out once he was winded. He seems like the clear lead back for this team. The question is how good the offense will be. I think Josh Johnson is an improvement for his rushing efficiency. All running quarterbacks tend to improve the rushing efficiency of their running backs. I do wonder, again, and this is just a concern for me with the whole LA offense, how much will Josh Johnson pass? How many yards will he pass for? How many touchdowns will he pass for? Will he scramble more? I don't have a great feel for what this offense feels like is going to be like, because if Johnson does scramble a lot, you probably like him as a quarterback option, but I'm not sure how much I trust that because of his injury. It's a tricky spot for LA. I'm looking a lot more on the Dallas side of this game. I think Dallas's offense is really entertaining in terms of the 80, I think it was 79 point something percent pass rate last week. And with Landry Jones back, you have the potential for them to throw the ball down the field a little bit more. Philip Nelson last week was checking down a ton. He threw 15 completions to his running backs, 4 different backs they used, but far and away the most receiving of any backfield. So, you talked about Hood. Hood ran more routes than any back last week. And I do agree with you. The target should probably follow for him over time. And I think he's very viable at a point. I trust Dallas's backfield to get the targets a little bit more, even with a new quarterback. Cameron Artis-Payne was their guy who led in snaps and in routes, but he also kind of seemed to get phased out later. He's a tricky one. I probably will have some of him. I'll also have some Lance Dunbar, who was their other main receiving back.
Yeah, and that's interesting thinking about what Landry Jones means for that offense. It's a really weird box score there from Philip Nelson, who completed like every pass he threw and just did not advance the ball downfield at all. So, Landry Jones is a guy who's been like so pumped up here by the XFL. He's obviously the clear-cut number 1 pick, that was assigned to the Dallas franchise, and people have just been sort of waiting on his return as some sort of chosen one. But I'm maybe a tad bit less, trusting that that's going to happen. I'd be interested to know what you think about Landry Jones. Is he all that he's hyped up to be, and should we expect, just sort of a complete revival of the Dallas offense with him under center?
Well, it's hard to know. It's hard to know how healthy he is, all those things. But the thing that I'm looking at is this guy has actually played in NFL games. He started NFL games and was decent. He wasn't great, but like, that's a lot more than you can say about the majority of the quarterbacks in this league, that he's actually played. Like Matt McGloin's played in NFL games and he was pretty bad.
Right.
Landry Jones was reasonably productive in that Steelers offense when he got some starts in 2018, I guess. And it ended up with a pretty solid line. And I think from a talent perspective, he's probably one of, if not the most talented passers in the XFL. I mean, like just based on the fact that he is able to have success at the NFL level, I think that's a pretty fair statement. But, there's reason to be concerned. There's reason to be concerned about both of these quarterbacks, about what we'll see and how they'll fit in the offense. We haven't seen these guys play since 2018, either Johnson or Landry Jones. It sounds like you're leaning more Johnson over Jones. I'm going to be leaning Landry over Johnson. So that'll be one of our little side bets for the week.
Yeah, I love it, man. I've just been a huge Josh Johnson stan ever since he played for my Redskins. Big DC sports homer here. And I don't check those allegiances at the door. But, when we're talking about Landry Jones and the Renegades, man, it's interesting. Another guy who you got to try to figure out which pass catchers to pair him with. I talked a little bit about Donald Parham as sort of this discount tight end option at 3,200. Like that's a pretty sweet little deal for what you're getting out of him. And he's 6'8". He's just a monster of a guy. And then they do throw to their running backs a good bit, but it looks like Flynn Nagel and Jeff Badette are sort of the clear-cut 1-2. Is there any reason to look much beyond that?
Nope. Yeah, Nagel, Badette, Parham are the 3 guys that I'm looking at. I think you can make a case for some of the other guys having potential, but I think they're hard to trust. Dallas was certainly the offense that like their route percentages were spread out the most, the most unconcentrated, if you will. But they also threw a ton, right? We're talking about that 80% pass rate, but no one on their offense ran routes on even 2/3 of the team's dropbacks. On several teams, we saw guys who ran a route on every single drop back. So that's a little bit concerning because we don't necessarily know if the ball will be spread around, if they'll rotate a ton. And so Gerard Hurd and Freddie Martino and Jazz Ferguson were all involved. They all ran between 34 and 51% routes per drop back. So there's there's a lot of guys there, but I'm mostly just going to look at Badet and Nagel as the main guys that I pair with, and then Parham as a tight end who has a pretty good track record catching passes in his past. So, yeah, that's how I'm approaching it.
What if I told you that Landry Jones, of all XFL quarterbacks, has the second highest college interception rate of all XFL quarterbacks? I did not anticipate that. And even in the Big 12, he couldn't throw to his own team. How about that?
I mean, that's a stat.
It,
The analytics community loves to say that quarterbacks need to take chances and be willing to throw interceptions. So I guess we count that as a positive.
Well, there you go. It's a stat, and whoever's column wants it. So, final game we got here, Ben. Battlehawks, Roughnecks. It's obviously this Houston offense is the one everybody's clamoring for. They put up the best showing in Week 1. Philip Walker looks like the star of the show so far. From what you saw of Philip Walker, do you anticipate that that's a sustainable level of production for him moving forward?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, did you watch it? Like, yeah, he was awesome. This offense is great. 4 wide on every play. He's mobile. He's athletic. He didn't even have to take off and run because he was just carving up LA's defense through the air. Yeah, he was really good. And I'm going to just eat the chalk at quarterback and try and differentiate at other places because I want him in my lineups. I have like a minor concern that maybe St. Louis's defense is good. Maybe that's why Philip Nelson had to check down a bunch because they're playing really good secondary work. I think probably it's more likely that Philip Nelson is just not very good and didn't take shots and wasn't willing to take shots. But we did see St. Louis just go into Dallas and force them to throw underneath all game and only put up 9 points. And not getting in the end zone. So maybe St. Louis has a little bit of a better defense than what the betting markets were expecting preseason when they had them as one of the worst teams in the league. But still, I think Philip Walker should be all right. I think he's going to be one of the top scoring quarterbacks pretty much every week. If you're not playing him, you're probably just hoping someone else has a big game and outproduces him. But I'm also playing him in cash, and in NFL we often don't pay up for quarterbacks in cash, but there is value at the skill position still here in week 2. We talked about some of that, and that means that Walker will be the guy that I'll be playing in cash for sure. The receiver I liked the most, that I was most impressed with, was Khalil Lewis. I didn't even play a ton of him last week, and he was a very popular play. But not only did he catch a short touchdown, but he was targeted on 2 of their conversion tries. He's running out of one of the 2 slot spots in this 4 wide offense. And it just seems like when they get into that tight space, they don't want to look to the outside receivers. They want guys like Lewis running these little whip routes and quick in breaking or out breaking routes. And like I said, he got targeted 3 times down there, including the conversions. And then Nick Hawley is their slot guy on the other side. He got targeted on a conversion. There was a defensive pass interference. He's actually listed as a running back on DraftKings. He's been moved over to a wide receiver on FanDuel. But he's like the cheapest way to get in this offense because Khalil Lewis, Sammy Coates, and Cam Phillips are all very high price. So Hawley is an interesting guy, gives you a lot of flexibility with your lineup. If you put him in at running back, you don't even have to play a running back because he's a slot receiver. Yeah, I like Lewis. I like Hawley as a cheap option. I also obviously like Cam Phillips, who ran routes on 100% of their dropbacks, had a 50-yard touchdown, was very good, should be very popular. And I still think you can go back to Sammy Coates. Tons of targets, tons of air yards last week. Wasn't productive. Everyone was complaining about him. Very high owned last week. People expected him to be the top player in the top receiver in the whole league. I know I had him ranked very, very high and played a ton of him. But I think he's a good guy to go back to this week because people will be off him. People will be on Phillips and Lewis. So he's a tournament pivot as well. I think you play all 4 of those guys with Walker and mix that up. And then Butler, we got to talk about too. James Butler, their running back. He was their 3rd stringer coming in. Didn't get his first touch until the 2nd quarter because Andre Williams played a little bit and D'Angelo Henderson came in. But both those guys banged up this week, both on the injury report. Butler took over that backfield from the 2nd quarter on, played the highest snap rate of any running back, scored 2 touchdowns, looked very good, looked better than Andre Williams, who got some touches. D'Angelo Henderson only played a few snaps, but neither of those guys are really healthy. They went signed another running back. I think Butler's going to be playing a ton in this game. He's also in my cash lineup. So yeah, I mean, this is an offense you want a lot of exposure to.
Yeah, and Henderson just recently announced out this game, so that'll be one fewer mouth to feed in that backfield. They do have one other running back on roster, Marquez Williams, who could potentially take over just a little bit of third running back duties. But yeah, it looks like James Butler will be able to project for some significant usage. It looks to me like James Butler and Elijah Hood are among the two, sort of top end running backs that you can project for double digit carries. I mean, there's just not a lot of guys that sort of fit that criteria, except for when you look across the field there, man, and you talk about these St. Louis Battlehawks, where Matt Jones is also sort of taking over in an injured backfield. Keith Ford not going to play this game, so it'll be Matt Jones, who himself was banged up, but is now looking more probable than not to play this week, splitting duties with Christian Michael. So my another former DC product, Redskins running back Matt Jones. Any reason not to play him? To me, I think he projects for the largest number of carries in the league.
Yeah, I mean, only 20 carry back last week was a lot more efficient than Michael, who rushed 7 times for no yards. But I mean, Jones started the game; he was their starter. That's not what we expected, but that's what we got.
Mm-hmm.
And he ran for 4 yards a carry, which is fine, right? But yeah, you have to think about him because St. Louis is going to run the ball. They made that very clear in week 1. They ran on like something like 60% of their plays. They were easily the highest running rate in week 1. The reason that I'm concerned about him, I have this stat that I look at called high value touches. Basically just looking at the receptions and the inside the 10 touches. So green zone, high value scoring opportunities. That's where the vast majority of running back touchdowns are scored, and receptions, where obviously we get a point for the reception and you get more yards per play on passing plays out of running backs than you do yards per rush. I tend to average about 8 yards per reception compared to 4 yards per rush, right? So Matt Jones had 21 carries, 0 high-value touches. Didn't catch a pass, didn't get any carries in the green zone. Christian Michael got their one look in there. He did get a conversion try, but he looks to me like that quintessential between the 20s running back who's going to rack up a lot of rushes and rushing yards, but that's not a high upside statistical profile. So a guy that I'll probably be fading.
That makes sense, and he'll be a pretty popular guy. Obviously, this week coming in as sort of the rushing volume leader. So, what about the receivers? Obviously, we're sort of discounting the passing game for St. Louis in general just because of the volume. Are we not as interested in Jordan Ta'amu? And what do we think about the pass catchers that he's paired with?
Yeah, I mean, he ran for the most yards in the league, right? But 37 of that, I think I mentioned earlier, was on a QB draw, and he's mobile. But I don't know how he still ranks in the bottom half of passers in the league for me, at least after watching week 1. He was fine. They won, but they scored 9 points in the fourth quarter on 2 drives that were set up by that one long QB draw, and then a long catch and run to DeMornay Pearsonell, his slot receiver, who was good in the AAF last year, had some upside on a weekly basis. But basically this offense wasn't particularly good in their win. They won 15-9. I'm not really on them. LaDainian Washington is the outside receiver. If you want to, play Ta'amu and you want to stack him with guys, it's Pearsonell or Washington for me. Washington got several targets, and then he also got a fade route thrown to him on a conversion that he caught out of bounds. But he's kind of like their bigger bodied outside guy that they're probably going to use in the red zone. So if you're using Ta'amu, those are the guys I'm stacking him with. But he's not in my I probably won't make a Ta'amu lineup because I think he's going to be fairly popular, and I just don't think the rushing yardage is sustainable and that he's that great of a passer.
Yeah, and I mentioned, not wanting to play all the quarterbacks. I just think you spread yourself too thin, even if you're playing 150. You be surprised how quickly 150 go away once you won a lot of PJ Walker and you won a lot of, Josh Johnson or whoever to fill them up with. You just can't afford to throw in those loser lineups with Ta'amu. Like I said, I kind of agree with you. I didn't see a whole lot of upside there. I mean, obviously, if that rushing were sustainable, if I mean, we've seen Lamar Jackson have great season, primarily made up of rushing ability, but it was more explosive rushing than rushing volume, which to me is, a little bit more predictive. So for right now, I'm just sort of fading Tamu, and those Battlehawks lineups, I think, is just sort of the right way to approach it. But yeah, I like LaDainian Washington there as a value, and just sort of as we said, like you only need so many value guys, but one thing that is kind of interesting is the number of receivers on roster. One, two, three, four, five, six receivers on roster for St. Louis, which is among the smallest groups in the league. And Brandon Riley, one of their receivers, is out this week. Carlton Agudosi didn't play at all last week. And so there could potentially only be four bodies rotating through. So anytime we can kind of sort of truncate that player pool and then possibly project out a little bit more concentration, that's sort of a benefit. That would be maybe one of the only things I could say is a reason to play Washington or Pearson L. But I think overall it's just sort of offense to avoid. You could maybe make the argument that if you're stacking up around PJ Walker, you probably want to have somebody there on the Battlehawk side, unless you just think they're going to get completely shellacked and not put up any points at all.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think you can run it back with Washington or Pearson now. I think there's guys you can consider. I'm looking at this offense, how run heavy they were is the big thing that I keep coming back to. And I do think Tamu's rushing is going to translate a little bit. I don't think it's like completely unsustainable. I think, I don't want to go too heavy on that point, but he's mobile. He's going to probably pick up some rushing yards every week, but I just don't know that he has like massive passing upside to go along with that. And if he doesn't run for 77 yards like he did last week, if he only runs for 30 yards, what is the passing upside in an offense that wants to be very run heavy? Now against Houston, they're going to trail, and they're probably going to have to pass a lot more frequently this week than they did last week. But, I just kind of taking a believe it when I see it with this offense a little bit. I'm just not completely sold.
Yeah, and it is the highest total on the board at 50 last time I checked. It makes it the highest. The lowest is the Tampa Bay Seattle game, which is down at 43.5. So these lines have changed a lot. They change like every time I look at them. They're up and down a little bit. I think they're really just trying to balance the market to the best of their ability rather than make a true predictive line. So overall, Ben, this looks like a really interesting time. I'm a little bit concerned that this may be the last huge prize pool week for XFL DFS. I'm hoping that's not the case, but looking like we got some good chance to play into some value situations.
Yeah, I agree, man. I think we went over pretty much most of it, but I don't think you have to shy away from the high price guys. And I think you can find value guys like Tolliver, Joe Horn, we talked about. You can find some value running backs that we talked about. Some of those pass catching guys, Holly and Dunbar, are a little bit cheaper. You mentioned Victor from New York, Darius Victor. And then, play a lot of receivers in your lineups for sure.
Absolutely. Ben, why don't you tell the people where they can find you?
Yeah, cbssports.com. Just mostly writing XFL these days. We'll be getting into some prospect stuff pretty soon. The Fantasy Football Today podcast, which you can find on iTunes. I'm on that a couple of times a week. So, yeah, you can check me out there.
Sounds good, man. Everybody, if you enjoyed this particular type of content, we hope to bring you some more live stuff here in the future. Make sure you're subscribing here. Click the subscribe button there on the Numberball YouTube channel, and we'll be able to keep you in the loop on all things we're doing here in the future. Hopefully this will be the start of many things to come for us. And Ben, many thanks for joining us this week. It's been a lot of fun. I hope I win $100,000 and you win 30, if that's okay with you.
That sounds good, man.
All right, man. Sounds good. We'll check you guys later. Thanks for joining.